Hello, welcome to this video. My name is Steven van der Leden. I'll be narrating this video, which is based on a webinar that I conducted during the first lockdown in the beginning of 2020. It's about climbing gear, and let's get started. First of all, a couple of things about the scope of the webinar and the scope of this video also. Of course, the video itself is no substitute for formal climbing instruction or training, but it can be used, of course, as a support for a climbing training course. This is mainly to allow you also to have something that you can review later on. Second of all, this webinar is very much about knowledge of equipment. It's not about the skills to use that equipment. So it's about knowing your equipment and how to use it. But to actually build a skill to use the climbing gear, of course you have to practice. And last but not least, I should also add a little disclaimer. Sometimes I make choices to show certain images of brands. The choices to show one brand or another is not inspired by sponsoring. I would just like to tell you that. So the reason why I use certain brands and why I don't use certain other brands is simply because those images were available to me on the internet, or they happen to be pieces of climbing gear that I have some experience with. So that's very often what sets the examples that I choose to show during this webinar. First off, let's start with a little bit of climbing gear history, because throughout time a lot has happened. As you can see in the picture on the slide right now, that is the way that we used to climb, in the beginning of the 20th century. So people would climb with hemp ropes around their waist, and they would have some kind of mountaineering boot, and that was pretty much it. Throughout time, especially as the group of people who practiced climbing grew, you can probably guess that there was innovation in gear as well. In the beginning, very, very isolated by individuals, and later on when, climbing really sort of was practiced by many people, you actually got brands that did their own research and also invented their own new gear and new ways of doing things. So everything started out with hemp ropes, pythons. The first nuts were literally nuts, machine nuts that were used in factories, for example. And those were simply threaded with a piece of rope, and those then were used as pieces of gear that people could actually jam into a crevice in the rock to make sure that they would have a point of protection. Then afterwards you got a time around the 70s and the 80s when rope harnesses came and helmets to protect your head against falling stones and such. It was certainly also possible to have screw gate carabiners with a sort of an extra level of security. And we're talking here about the time that I started climbing myself. Back then there were a couple of things which are also very much affected by the gear and the state of the gear that it was back then. For example, it was very common in those days to turn the top carabiner of your quick draw, and the reason for that was because there were not really uniform bolts. The bolts that were available, the way they were constructed, there was only a limited amount of freedom and flexibility that could be applied to the construction of such materials. And that meant that when you practiced climbing, you needed to do some things to keep you safe. Later on, we got a lot more innovations, like for example the flexible stem camming devices, which eliminate the problems that you would otherwise have with a lever, the effect of a lever which could break gear. There's also been many advances in belay devices, especially the semi-automatic belay devices, which sort of lock off the rope when it's weighed. That's really an innovation that only came up in the last 25 years. And of course the advent of lightweight equipment. There's a lot of equipment nowadays which is very lightweight, which is available as well, which is an important factor if you're bringing your gear on an expedition or a long journey in which you have to carry your gear actually on your back with a backpack to get to the place where you want to climb. So that brings us to today, and the role of climbing gear in climbing is really important in terms of safety. You can generally say that with the innovations that have been applied to climbing gear, climbing has become a more safe outdoor pursuit. And you know, of course, still you need to have the right knowledge and the right skills to use your equipment safely. But if you have the right knowledge and the right skills, it is possible to make climbing relatively safe, especially if you compare it to the old days when people were climbing like what I'm showing on the picture right now. What's going to be the topics of this webinar? I'm going to start with a couple of bare essentials, talk about the climbing harness, climbing shoes, carabiners, belay device, climbing rope and helmet. And of course the climbing rope is a bit of a special type of equipment, so I'm going to spend a little bit more attention about that actually, more attention to that, because it's a special type of equipment if you compare to the other ones. I'm also going to give you a couple of Essentials Plus, like information about slings, quick draws and static rope if you would be using that. And last but not least, the topic for this webinar also will be buying climbing gear. In other words, what should you watch out for, what you should try to do when you're trying to buy climbing gear. We'll start off with the harness. So the harness basically is the piece of gear that connects the rope to your body. And in that sense, it's a very, very vital piece of equipment. A failing harness is a problem because, of course, that's a critical part of the belay chain. What I'm showing on this picture, in the big picture over there, that's a sport climbing harness. So that's a harness that goes around your waist and you've got loops for your legs. And in the small inset picture that you see to the bottom right there, this is an integrated harness, which is, for example, used for small children and also in some industrial applications. For the size of the climbing gear, it's always important to be able to try it on, of course, because you have to make sure that you actually fit into your harness if you want to use it. The question is also very much where should you tie into the rope with the harness. This is something where the manual of a harness can give you some clarity. And always keep in mind, if you don't have the manual of the harness, you normally will be able to find it online with the website of the manufacturer. Another question is whether the harness is adjustable, yes or no. The example that I'm showing you on the screen here has adjustable leg loops, which can be very useful in some situations. Some harnesses don't have this, but nowadays it seems to become more and more common that harnesses are fully adjustable no matter what. And the last question is whether you want to have a lightweight harness or not. And again, you know, carrying it on your back with a lot of other gear would be a consideration to go for a lightweight harness. Lightweight harnesses are normally a little bit more expensive and also they tend to be a little bit more uncomfortable. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. Something else important to consider if you buy gear is the number of gear loops that you have available. On this harness that I'm showing you in the big picture, there are 4 gear loops. You can see 2 of them on the right side. There's also 2 on the opposite side of the harness, which are obscured by the harness itself. I would say that if you have the ambition to start lead climbing, it is good to have a harness with at least 4 gear loops. So not 2, but 4. Something that you want to also consider is that these gear loops, they are the point where you put your gear. They are not the same as the tie-in point that you have at the front of your harness, which is in this case in the left side of the picture. And some of the older harnesses, this is something that you won't see very much anymore today, but still some of the older harnesses, they were constructed in such a way that you would actually have to tie back the buckle at the top of the harness to make it safe. This is something which is not common anymore, but still you want to be aware of that. These harnesses can be recognized because it's possible to open them up. The harness that I'm showing you on the picture right now is one which you can basically set to its maximum size and then you slide into it from the top, but it can't really open. There are harnesses that can open, and if you encounter such a harness, it is very important to remember that the buckle needs to be tied back. Right, so that's a little bit about climbing harnesses. Next up, let's have a look at some maintenance and replacements. Well, harnesses, first of all, are what I refer to as software. And what I mean by software is it's plastic, nylon. In other words, it's not metal. And software should be replaced in time because it is exposed to UV radiation, and this UV radiation will slowly make the equipment less strong. So it will weaken the equipment through time, and this is something you want to consider. So there is a sort of a practical limit to the age of a harness. However, apart from that, what is very important, of course, is to inspect your harness regularly and at least yearly to observe signs of wear and tear. Because in the picture that I'm showing you on this slide to the right side, you can see that the tie-in point over there is basically going through. So there's been too much wear and tear actually, and that one should be replaced. So inspecting your gear, and that is something I'm going to repeat over and over again, is very important. It is much more important than saying, I will automatically replace my gear after, let's say, 10 years. Because if you do that and you wait for 10 years before you do your first inspection, your gear might already be damaged. Harnesses, how long they last really depends on the usage of it. There's harnesses that will be okay for 10 years and then still they won't show you any signs of wear and tear, and that's perfectly fine. But if you are climbing a lot, then actually, your harness might only last 2 or 3 years or even less. Whenever you're in doubt, replace. Whenever you are thinking, okay, this looks a little bit funky, but I'm not sure, I would generally say adopt the rule, if in doubt, replace. You might argue with the picture on this slide. You see that, yes, there's a hole in it, but it's not totally through. So this might be a situation where you're in doubt. Well, in this case, you want to replace this gear. Why? Because remember, a climbing harness, and that is true for what I'm going to say now, is true for most of the climbing gear, has a critical role in your safety. So in other words, if this fails, you're basically either very much injured or dead. So if in doubt, you just want to replace the gear. Okay, next up, let's talk about climbing shoes. Climbing shoes come more or less in 3 types. You've got climbing shoes with laces, shown on the right there. Climbing shoes with a Velcro, which acts like a thing to close basically the shoe but without laces. That's what you can see to the left there. And at the bottom you see an example of a slipper, a shoe that actually doesn't have a closing mechanism. Always a question with shoes is how tight they should be. This is something that you'll have to judge for yourself, but definitely you should not have any space in the shoe itself. So if you are trying on a shoe and it's pretty much comfortable and you can move your foot around within the shoe, it is not good. It is too big. Your foot should be in contact with all the places of the shoe. And I know this is very uncomfortable, but it is necessary for us to be able to climb and to have a good contact with the rock. Generally, I would say, as long as you don't have any space, then you're pretty much safe, and then you can, go as tight as you feel goes for you. Personally, I have climbed on shoes which were too tight, which meant that I was distracted actually by the pain in my toes. And if that is the case, I think you take it a little bit too far. However, you also want to consider that when you buy a climbing shoe and you start using it, that over time it's going to actually loosen up a little bit. So if a shoe, in other words, if you buy a shoe and it's pretty tight right now, it's going to get better over time. There's also a warning in that, because if you buy a comfortable shoe right now, you always have to also consider that over time it might get looser, and then a comfortable shoe will become an unusable shoe because it's simply not tight enough. Another question always is the shape of the shoe. Should it be a banana shape or a straight shape? Generally, we can say that the straight shape, which you can see to the top right there, is one which is more comfortable because it's a little bit more the shape of your foot, whereas the banana shape, which is shown on the left with that left shoe over there, is less comfortable, but because it will give tension in some areas of your foot, you will have better control. So in other words, for better control of what you're doing in the rock, the banana shape is actually better. But you have to consider also what you are going to use your shoe for. To be honest, if you're going to go into the high mountains and you're going to climb routes in which you will have to wear your shoes all day, you want to have a straight shoe. On the other hand, if you're going to do short sport climbing routes, the banana shape might be fine, because then between routes you will take off your shoes and you will simply use slippers or sandals or whatever else you have available. Maintenance and replacement of shoes. Well, first of all, they're not safety equipment, so you can replace them when you need to. In other words, there's no maximum age of a shoe or something like that. I think the shoes that you're seeing in this picture are a good example of shoes that I would probably replace, because toes are basically showing through the shoes. And the fact that the toes are coming through also means that those are the places of the shoe that have been used most. And it means that, if you would go climbing like this, you probably need very strong toes, and also toes that don't have too many nerve endings in them, because it's going to be very painful experience otherwise. Replacing shoes. If you buy shoes for the first time, you have to try out different brands and sizes. If you find a shoe that you're very happy with, record the brand and the size, because that means that next time it is possible for you to simply go online, find the cheapest provider and order those shoes with that size with that provider. If you really like shoes and they are not available anymore, what you can also consider to do is do a sole replacement. And this is something which is sometimes done, especially in countries where climbing is a big sport. On Curacao, we don't really have a place which replaces the soles of climbing shoes. We will probably have shoe shops that will replace the soles on normal shoes, but replacing the soles of climbing shoes is actually a totally different business. So I would never go to a normal shoe store to get a replacement for the soles of your climbing shoes. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you are storing your shoes, please wait to store them until they are dry. And what I mean by storing is if you put them in a box or something like that. If they are still wet because you've just used them, so they're sweaty on the inside, it is a very good idea to first dry them, not out in the sun, because you don't want to burn out the glue and rubber, but you can simply, lie them in your chamber or something like that for them to dry, and then when they dried, then you put them basically away in a box. Of course, you don't have to store them in a box. If that is the case, you simply put them somewhere and they dry because they're in a ventilated space, and then of course this is not much of a problem. But you have to consider that when you put wet shoes inside a box, mold can exist, etc., etc. It's not good, of course. Next up are carabiners. Carabiners are also a very vital part of the belay chain, because whichever way you tie into the rope, the belay device of the belayer is always going to be connected to the harness using a carabiner. So this is also a vital part of the belay chain. There's three types of carabiners here, from the left to the right. The left one is a snapper or a normal carabiner. There's only one operation required to open it. You simply press down on the clip and the carabiner will be opened. The middle one is what we call a screw gate carabiner. This is a carabiner that can be screwed shut, and if so, it means that it requires two operations to open. First you have to unscrew it, and then second you have to press down on the snapper to open it. And last but not least, the one on the right there, that's a DMM Belay Master actually, is a triple protected or an extra protected carabiner. And this is a carabiner that actually requires three operations to open. The black thingy needs to be undone, then the screw needs to be loosened, and then the snapper can be pressed down to open the carabiner. The last category there to the right, the extra protected carabiners, are customary to use in a situation where you use a carabiner to tie into the rope. So this is very common if you go, for example, to a climbing gym abroad, or in Holland, for example. You will normally see that there's knots in the end of the rope, and you're supposed to tie into the knot using a carabiner. In those cases, very often there's a mandatory use of an extra protected carabiner for that. Other considerations, there's sometimes pear-shaped carabiners. Actually, the one which is to the right there, the Belay Master, is an example of a pear-shaped carabiner. If you are going to go multi-pitch climbing and you need to use the Munter hitch, you need such a pear-shaped carabiner. It doesn't really have to be an extra protected carabiner. They also exist in the form of screw-gate carabiners. Another question, of course, always is, what is the strength of a carabiner? And this is customary always shown on the body of the carabiner and is measured in kilonewtons. And kilonewtons, basically, if you compare this to, let's say, kilograms, then you can basically say that 23 kilonewtons that you can see over there, that's the strength of the carabiner in the long axis. That's the way that the carabiner should be used. That's the maximum strength, 23 kilonewton, or 23,000 newton, or in other words, 2,300 kilograms. There's also a different strength rating. You also see an arrow up and down with an 8. That is loading the carabiner over its short axis. If you do it like that, you see that it only can hold 8 kilonewtons. So in other words, just 800 kilograms. Quite a difference from those 2,300 kilograms that it can hold when it's loaded over its long axis. It's important to know this difference because it will tell us what the carabiner has been made to basically hold. And of course, using it along its long axis is the most logical way of using it, and there's a reason for it because it's strongest that way. The final symbol over there, also with an 8 next to it, is to indicate what the carabiner strength is when the snapper has been opened. So when the snapper is opened up, it's pressed down, and if the carabiner then is is loaded, it means that it will still hold 8 kilonewtons or 800 kilograms. The whole message of this is, you want to use the carabiner along its long axis because that's where it's the strongest one. And the strength of 23 kilonewtons, there's actually a norm for this of 22 kilonewtons in the long axis. That's sort of the minimum that a climbing carabiner should hold. Please note there's also a reference to a CE norm over there, 0333. That's probably a PPE or a personal protective equipment norm, which is created by the European Union, and which is sort of a normal standard that we will be looking for to accomplish when we are using this climbing equipment and when it's being fabricated, of course. This is normally what they use for the test. The standard would say you need to do certain things in the test. It needs to have a minimum strength. All these things, they are basically put down in standards, and then if the carabiner is tested against that standard and it's shown to meet the requirements of the standard, it gets that number of the CE norm. Some important things to consider with carabiners. First of all, there's something called a key lock, and to show you what this is basically the way that the snapper connects to the rest of the carabiner. And the small picture there to the left is basically the classical system, in which you can see a little hook. And nowadays it's much more common to have this modern system that you can see to the right there with the green arrow. That's what we refer to as a key lock a carabiner. The big advantage of key lock is that because there is no hook at the end of the carabiner, it's going to be easier to operate it with the rope. Another innovation that's been realized in the past 20 years is the WireGate carabiner and anti-whiplash carabiners. These are the carabiners that look a little bit like a solid piece of metal, and then suddenly you get this sort of how do you say, a sort of a clip, let's say, which looks really tiny. Now the whole idea of this is to minimize the mass of the snapper, which can be moved, to avoid the problem that if the carabiner is slammed against the wall, that because of the mass which would be in the snapper, that the snapper would open at that moment. Don't be fooled, the fact that the metal in these wire gate snappers is really thin doesn't mean that it's not strong. It's strong enough to actually keep the load. And like I said, because of the thing with the strength, it's always important to avoid side, cross and open loading. Just to give you a couple of examples of what that could look like. So you see over there, that first picture to the right, you can see that the carabiner is actually loaded across an edge. And that means that you get a lever effect, which basically makes the whole construction a lot weaker. The same is true for the picture to the right, where you can see that when the carabiner is actually loaded, the gate is opened. So you're then again facing that situation where the carabiner is actually able to hold less weight than when it would be used in the way that it should be used with a closed snapper. Some maintenance and replacement. Well, first of all, carabiners are metal hardware. They are not software. And that means that because they are made out of metal, we don't have the issue that we have, for example, with harnesses, that we are dealing with carabiners that will get old over time because the sun is on them. So metal hardware doesn't have to be replaced unless it's worn or damaged. And you can see some examples over there to the right of carabiners that have been used a lot. And these have really been used very much. And basically it's said nowadays that when half of the material of the carabiner is gone, then you should probably be looking at a replacement for it, because it's just becoming too much. This is something that is actually hard to accomplish in the lifetime of a carabiner unless it's being used really, really a lot. And carabiners, they fail seldomly if you use them correctly. The photos that I showed you with the last slide were just examples of how not to use carabiners. And if you use them like that, then yes, there's going to be a problem and they might actually fail. But if they're going to be used in the right way, it is very seldom for carabiners to fail. You do want to have a yearly inspection though, to look for sharp edges and wear and tear, such as the photo on the top of this slide. And something else that you want to look for is whether the gate remains open. Normally you open the carabiner, either if it's a snapper by simply pressing down on it, if it's a carabiner with a screw gate, simply by unscrewing it and keeping it open. Normal operation of a carabiner is that if you press the gate open and you release it, it should spring back into the original position. If it doesn't, you need to consider that either it's damaged or there might be dust and it needs lubrication. Lubrication, if possible, with some synthetic oil, like for example Teflon spray or something like that. And of course, if that doesn't help, and your gate still remains open, so you press down on the gate and it doesn't spring back into its original position, I would say, that's a situation again where you might be in doubt, then you need to replace your carabiner. Okay, next up, belay devices. So belay devices are the devices that we use as a belayer, basically to hold on to the rope. As you probably know, just holding on to the rope by grabbing it, let's say, is of course not a way that you'll be able to arrest all falls, especially if somebody's falling quite a distance or is the same weight. So that's why we have belay devices. Belay devices are the rope is put through it, and next up the belay device is attached to your harness, and that means that you have basically a sort of a brake function. It means that you will have to hold on to the rope, but if the climber falls or hangs from the rope, much of the weight is actually transferred onto your harness, and that means that you as a person will be the counterweight for it. Here's 3 families of different belay devices. There's many of them on the market. Figure of 8 there to the left. Not very common anymore, I must say, but still, if you need to give a very dynamic belay, this is a very good device. Then in the middle there is the tuber family. The tuber family is actually very, very, very popular. It's also the most commonly seen belay device. And on the right side over there is a Grigri, which is an example of the half-automatic family of belay devices. And these are belay devices which basically lock up automatically once the rope is weighed. There are some belay devices that actually combine the characteristics of a tuber and a Grigri together, like for example the Gigajoule. These are specialized belay devices. In belay devices there are many innovations, and you know, every climbing brand basically has its own belay devices, and very often they have their own specific innovations or ways to deal with things. If you're going to go and multi-pitch routes, either in the Alps or in the rocks, then very often you'll also run into the Munter hitch, which basically is not a belay device. It's a special type of carabiner, the pear-shaped carabiner we discussed before. And this is a carabiner that can be used with a Munter hitch, which is also a way of belaying. With all these belay devices, I think it's always a bit of a problem to get a choice, you know, to make a choice, because there's so much available. And what is best? Well, there's a couple of things to consider. First of all, the situation where you will be belaying, the environment, in other words, the rock and the roots that you have, and of course also the skills of your belayer. Normally, what you see very often is that people will have their own belay device, but sometimes belay devices have to be shared with other people. And you want to consider that if you want to buy a very exotic piece of equipment, then you will have to teach your belayer actually to use it. Regardless of what you choose for, correct operation is always vital. It doesn't matter which belay device you buy. Yes, one belay device is more comfortable than another one, or requires less of an effort to operate, but still it is very important that during the belay device is used correctly and that the attention is always with the person who is climbing. Main difference between the tuber family, that top row of pictures, the middle over there, and the half automatic family, which is to the right there, the green Grigri is an example of that, is that with the half automatic belay devices, they are now sort of preferred for single pitch rock climbing. In other words, climbing routes which simply, you know, are one rope length. You don't have to be on a belay station before you go on. Very often nowadays we say for those kinds of routes, and that's the majority of sport climbing, the Grigri or another half-automatic belay device is best, because there's not too much strength required to actually arrest the rope. And there's also less room for disasters in special situations. For example, if you're dealing with a big difference in weight between the belayer and the climber. Talking about maintenance and replacement, metal hardware, again, belay devices, doesn't have to be replaced unless it's worn or damaged, or if it's, for example, extremely rusted. What you do want to look out for with a yearly inspection is these sharp edges. So I'm putting a red circle around that area over there. You can probably imagine if the belay device is really used a lot, then there's going to be wear and tear that's going to result in sharp edges. If that happens, it needs to be replaced. And also, of course, if you are in doubt. Next up is an important one, the climbing rope. Let's have a look at that. Well, first of all, climbing rope is always dynamic rope. I would like to stress that very much. There's also static rope on the market, but this is not meant for climbing. Dynamic rope is meant for climbing. What is the difference between dynamic and static rope? Dynamic rope is basically rope that stretches. And this is a little bit like a car that is running into a block of concrete with 50 kilometers per hour. The car, of course, normally has a zone which crumples on impact, and that basically breaks you. If you are in the car, it's not like you go from 50 kilometers per hour to 0 kilometers per hour in an instant. No, there's going to be a very short period in time, perhaps a couple of milliseconds even, in which you are braked. But that is also the way that dynamic rope works. Dynamic rope stretches basically to absorb the impact. And that is why it is safe to climb with climbing rope. And that is also the reason why it's not safe to climb with static rope. Because a static rope, if you're falling, it's again like that, like you're sitting in that car that is driving 50 kilometers per hour and runs into a block of concrete which is standing still. Climbing on a static rope is like you don't have a crumpling zone or anything basically to catch it, and that's pretty deadly. Dynamic ropes always come in three types: single rope, twin rope, or half rope. And actually, the way I'm showing them here from left to right is first single rope, that's that one over there, twin ropes, half ropes, which is that half symbol that you can see in the middle, and twin ropes, which is that sort of 8, that infinity figure that's lying on its that 8 that's lying on its side over there to the right. Whenever you do something with rope, you want to consider the rope diameter, because your belay device and your project need to be able to work with that. If your belay device is actually not made for ropes which are as thin as the ones that you are using now, and this is very possible. I mean, belay devices in the past used to be able to deal with a certain range of diameters of rope, but nowadays ropes are a lot skinnier than they used to be. So that's something you want to consider. You want to consider the rope length. This is very important, because remember, in a normal sport climbing situation, you need the rope to be at least twice as long as the route that you're climbing. There's always the question to whether you're going to use a coil rope, whether you are coiling the rope, or whether you use a bag. A bag has the advantage that you can actually carry it around, and you don't have to put the rope out, let's say. You can simply climb from the bag. The disadvantage, of course, is then you need a rope bag or something like that, but it can be as easy as even having a shopping bag. And very important, I've put 2 exclamation marks there. Please always put a knot in the end of your rope whenever you climb. It doesn't matter whether you have a 70-meter rope and you're climbing a route of 50 meters high. Yes, of course, you're never going to run out of rope. But making it a routine to put a knot in the end of your rope is probably going to save you at least once during your climbing career. Because you have to remember, you are not always using your own rope, and you don't always know exactly how high the rock is. So it is not very outlandish to think that you might run into a situation where actually one moment you are being lowered down by your belayer, and that your belayer runs out of rope. In that situation, if there's a knot in the end of the rope, there's something to stop the belayer. There's something to make the belayer aware of the fact that they are at the end of the rope. Which is very different from when you don't have a knot in the end of the rope, because then what happens is that probably the belayer will just let go of the rope and it will shoot through the belay device and the climber falls down, with all consequences. Alright, some rope maintenance and inspection. Rope again is software, so it should be replaced in time. And perhaps even quicker than other software. Why? Because rope is such a critical equipment, and it is also a piece of equipment which is loaded all the time and used all the time, and it stretches, so it moves over the surface. That means there's going to be additional wear and tear. The picture that I'm showing you is typically something that might be a result from the rope being loaded across an edge. So the situation that you see over there is that the core of the rope, that's the white piece, is actually showing through the mantle. And this is a very good indication that this piece of rope needs to be retired. Loading across edges is something which will very often happen when you are top roping. Just to give you an example of this, 2 situations here. To the left you can see that somebody has built an anchor, and the green rope is actually the rope that people are climbing on. And you can see that that rope is going across an edge over there. And that is not an ideal situation. If there's a sharp edge, it's going to be dangerous because the rope can actually be cut. But even if it's not a sharp edge, in this situation, you can probably understand that if the climber is going to climb, the rope, the green rope, is going to rub over the rock. So there's going to be additional wear and tear. So in that situation, the right picture is actually better. You can see that over there with the red rope, the anchor has actually been extended across the ledge. And that means that now the green rope is hanging free. And that's actually a much better scenario. So I think, if you would be a very lazy climber and you would be like, I don't want to check all my gear every year. If you have to make a concession, please at least inspect your rope yearly, because that is something that you really need to function correctly. But nevertheless, I would generally advise you to inspect all your gear yearly, no matter what. If you lend your rope to other people, you have to very carefully think about whether you actually want to do that. But if you do it, please inspect it once you get it back. Always keep in mind also, how easy is it still to handle? Because as ropes get older through time, what you will see is that they become thicker, they become plushier, and that means that it's going to be harder to operate the rope with a belay device. If the mantle is damaged, try to feel the core. Sometimes the mantle is damaged and you don't see the core of the rope. Then what you want to do is you want to feel the core to feel whether it's been cut, yes or no. If it's being cut, you will feel that the rope is actually thinner at the place where the damage is. And if this is the case, then probably that's a piece of the rope that you want to get rid of. If it's at the end, which very often is the case, then you have the opportunity to just remove that, to cut it out, and then you will be left with a slightly shorter rope. If your rope is really dirty, you can wash it, but you want to be very careful with that, because washing, you can't do it an unlimited number of times. So what you can also consider to do is just to shower it, for example, with a garden hose or something like that. Very often the thing which will make the rope dirty is, for example, sand or dust. But always keep in mind also that if you use a rope bag, that's also a way, of course, to avoid dust from coming into your rope in the first place. And of course, if in doubt, replace or cut out the suspected parts. Don't forget to burn off the end, because if you don't, it's going to get plushy and it's going to slowly eat up your rope. So you want to burn off the end. It's basically a plastic, so if you put it to a candle or to a lighter or something like that, it's going to melt a little bit, and that means that you will get a solidified end of the rope. Then helmet. Helmets are also coming in different forms and shapes. You've got hard shell helmets, soft shell helmets, and so-called hybrids. A hard shell helmet is one which has a hard shell of plastic, and normally there's a system inside that goes onto your head with slings. The soft shell is basically a very lightweight helmet, which is normally a little bit thicker, but because it's very lightweight, it's a very comfortable thing to wear. And the hybrid is basically both of them together. So there's a hard shell on the outside and there's a soft shell on the inside. So what to choose for? Well, hard shell normally is more sturdy, whereas the soft shell helmet is very comfortable. And if you want to have a little bit of both of these worlds, then it's best to buy a hybrid helmet. Of course, weight is a consideration as well. Weight and comfort are very closely related to each other when it comes to helmets. And what you also want to consider is, what do you need protection against? It's of course against falling stones, but sometimes it's also against falling gear, like carabiners that are dropped, for example. And of course, during climbing, it may be that if you're climbing a traverse and you fall and you make a swinging fall, then it might actually be to slam your head into the rock, and that's also where a helmet can offer some protection. Something to keep in mind with the soft shell helmet is that even though it is very comfortable, it also is a helmet that needs to be replaced very quickly if an impact is suffered by it. So what you get is that if, for example, a stone strikes your soft shell helmet, you're going to see the impact on the helmet, and that probably means that you will need to replace it. Maintenance and replacement. Well, helmets are also software, they're also plastic, so they also should be replaced over time because of the UV radiation. And of course, you want to inspect your helmet yearly, and of course after a heavy impact. The example picture there to the right is a good example of a helmet which has suffered a big impact. Now, if it is actually cracked, then you probably agree with me that this is a helmet that really needs to be replaced, because this is not safe anymore. So if in doubt, replace. And that took us through the bare essentials of rock climbing. That's basically the stuff that you would be using if you're climbing outdoor without lead climbing. If you're going to go into lead climbing, you get additional gear that becomes important, like slings, quick draws, and static rope. Let's have a look at slings first. First of all, there's a question whether if you're going to buy a sling for climbing, that is very often something that you use to construct anchors or as a lifeline. There's always going to be a question, do you choose nylon or Dyneema? They are both very strong materials. However, there are differences between these materials. Dyneema can normally be created in thinner slings, which means that there's an opportunity to, for example, thread features a little bit more easily with Dyneema than with nylon, which normally is a little bit broader. In the breaking strength, they are more or less equal. They meet the same requirements. However, Dyneema is less resistant to slipping when you knot it. So if you put a knot into Dyneema, you have to consider that the knot is going to slip. And the resistance to wear normally is a little bit bigger with nylon than with Dyneema. And I know that there's been some videos that are going around on the internet that show that actually Dyneema is going to break in a couple of situations where nylon is actually going to hold a fall. But what people should realize is that whenever you fall a certain distance, that should always be something that you do with dynamic rope. The static stuff, like slings for example, are just to hang from. And why? Because if you fall on static materials, it will create such an impact force that you will be severely wounded, if not incapacitated, even though the gear might still be alright. So the gear might be alright, but you might not be. And even if it saves you, then you would be severely injured. So in other words, whenever you are climbing and you are in a situation where there's a falling potential, you should always be on a dynamic rope, not on a static rope or a sling. Then of course, if you buy a sling, the important question is always how long should it be? And I would say that it really depends on what you're using it for. Of course, if you're making extendable quick draws, for example, you need a sling which is not too long, for example. But if you're going to use it, for example, to create an anchor, it might be very useful to have a very long sling. Slings can also be bought in just a length, and if you do that, then you will have to knot your sling. There's a special knot to do that. However, I would generally say that if you have a choice, always try to choose stitched slings over knotted slings. Why? Because the knot tends to be placed once, and then if it is used repeatedly, there is a tendency for the knot to start to slip. And if you are not aware of this risk, then what will happen is that at one moment in time, you might actually be running into a situation where your knot is actually undone because the sling has just slipped through the knot. And then your piece of sling suddenly is no longer a loop, but it's simply a single piece of sling. So in other words, if you are, I would only choose for a knotted sling if you really have no alternative. In other words, if you can't do it otherwise. Otherwise, stitched is always better. Some maintenance and replacement. This is also software, so it should also be replaced in time. UV radiation. You want to inspect it to observe signs of wear and tear. And I must say that in this situation that I'm showing with the picture to the right, there's not really any doubt there. This is a sling that has failed and needs to be replaced. Probably it has been cut by something like a sharp edge on a rock or something like that. And that's of course a very good indication that it needs to be replaced. Then we get to quick draws. And what are quick draws? Quick draws are basically two normal carabiners, two snappers, and a specialized sling, which is also stitched. And these are used by lead climbers to basically secure themselves against the fall. So you clip a bolt with one of the carabiners and you clip the rope into the other carabiner. And the idea is that then as you climb above your bolt, if you fall down, you fall twice the distance, and that's sort of it. There's different lengths to these, as you can see. They can be very short, they can be very long. It all depends a little bit on the way that the rope goes through the roots. Normally there is a rope side and there's a bolt side. You will see that at the bolt side of the quick draw, normally the carabiner can't be turned around, whereas at the bolt side, at the rope side, it's not possible to turn the carabiner around. On the bolt side, normally it is possible to reverse the carabiner if you need to. And sometimes people also use banana-shaped carabiners, like the one that I'm showing there in the middle of the picture at the bottom. Banana-shaped carabiners have the advantage that it's easier to clip them, so it's easier to clip the rope into them. However, if you're going to go into multi-pitch traverses, alpine climbing and such, it is better not to use these carabiners. But in sports climbing routes, it is perfectly okay to use them. And of course, you know, the quick draw, because there's a sort of that piece of sling in the middle, that is something which is software. So that should also be inspected, and it should also be replaced after a number of years. And of course, you want to inspect these as well. This is also very much an example of a situation where there's not really any doubt, because this needs to be replaced, of course. And the carabiners in the quick draws are to be treated just like any other carabiner. Then there's static rope. Static rope is a bit of a specialized piece of equipment. Why? Because for climbing, normally the things that you can do with static rope are also things that you can do with slings. But the advantage of static rope is sometimes that you can simply have a piece of rope which can be used, for example, for anchor construction and such. However, it's a little bit harder to take it, for example, in a route. You know, if you're climbing a route, then it's easier to actually take a sling than a piece of static rope, because the static rope normally is a little bit longer. So there's different diameters to static ropes. 10mm rope is very often used for access, for rappelling and ascending ropes. The nice thing being that if you use a static rope for example, rappelling, there's no stretch in the rope because it's not dynamic. So it means that it's also less of a wear and tear on the rope. There's also 8mm rope, which is sometimes used to create anchors with trees, features. They are very often used to replace slings. And finally, 5 to 6mm static rope is used as a prusik, which can be used as a backup to when you are rappelling or ascending rope. And what to use this for? Well, basically, for example, to reach an anchor from above. If you're trying to install a top rope without lead climbing it, a piece of static rope is something which can be useful to create a natural anchor to reach the bolted anchor from the top of the rock, for example, especially when it's combined with a prusik. As said before, don't use static rope for climbing, please. This is very dangerous. Any length that you fall of a static rope is going to be a big impact on the climber, but it's also going to be a big impact on all the pieces of protection and on the belayer, the person who belays. We talked about rope before, and the same goes here. It is software, so it should be replaced in time. You want to avoid, again, the loading across edges. Here's again an example of a rope in which the core is actually showing through the mantle. I would replace this. I wouldn't want to use this anymore. You want to inspect it yearly, observe the signs of wear and tear, and then if in doubt, of course, you want to replace it. The good news is that static rope is less prone to wear and tear than a dynamic rope because it doesn't stretch. So remember that if you are, for example, rappelling from a dynamic climbing rope, this is of course something you can simply do, but you always have to consider that when you do that, the rope is going to stretch across surfaces, and that means that there's going to be additional wear and tear. So if you're going to go only rappelling and you don't do anything else, you don't do any climbing, if you have a static rope, you probably want to choose for the static rope then. But this, of course, is very often is not the case. You know, if you would go climbing, then you would have your dynamic climbing rope with you, and that would then also be logically the rope that you want to use for the rappel, because you're not going to take the static rope with you and climb with that simply because you want to do a rappelling. Okay. And before I go on, I would like to say something about the ages, because I've talked about software such as harnesses, climbing rope, helmets, slings, quick draw, static rope. And I've said, you know, over time this will be weakened by UV radiation. If you want to be on the safe side, I would say software, replace it after 10 years. And, you know, perhaps if you are feeling that your software is still really sturdy, you might be able to use it a couple of years extra. But you want to always inspect, at least on a yearly basis. Have a look at your gear, see if it's still good enough. Generally, I would say that it also depends on what you're using it for. You know, for example, a dynamic rope for lead climbing, I would never use it more than 10 years. After 10 years, I would say if the rope still looks good, okay, I can still perhaps use it for rappelling or for top roping, but I'm not going to lead climb off that rope anymore. Okay, next up, let's have a look at buying climbing gear. A hot topic, because here on the island of Curacao, it's very hard to get your own climbing gear. So you want to be very careful when you make a purchase. So if you want to purchase climbing gear, first of all, if you go online, you'll see that there's a lot of climbing gear brands, stores available. And of course, you want to make sure that your equipment is actually safe to use. Well, first of all, you can look for the CE mark. The CE mark is basically a mark which states that this equipment has been tested for a CE standard. And you know, we should be very careful, because nowadays you will also see China export, which is sometimes also printed on materials, which is not the same as the CE mark. So to the left, to the bottom left there, you see an example of a CE mark. To the right there is an example of a China export. If you don't see the CE mark, you can also look for the UIAA mark. The UIAA is a international alpine association, and they also have their own standards for testing. So, you know, that is one thing to look for. Look for the markings that it meets a certain standard. What you can also consider to do is try to buy from one of the big brands. These are a couple of examples of them, which are, you know, specialized companies that make climbing equipment. And you know that if you buy something like climbing gear of one of these brands, then you are pretty sure that it's meant for climbing, you know, and that you can actually depend upon it that it's safe equipment. Be suspicious of really low prices. Perhaps it goes without saying, but if the price is really low, you have to ask yourself, okay, what does that mean for the quality of the equipment? And when you're buying second-hand equipment, be very careful also, because you have to be able to trust the seller. You haven't used the climbing equipment yourself, but in the end, the decision to say whether climbing equipment is safe depends on its history. So what has happened with the climbing gear? And, you know, if you ask somebody who sells you second-hand climbing gear, if you ask that person what has happened with the gear, you have to be able to trust them, of course, that they're going to tell you the truth. There's also a bit of worst case scenario thinking there. I would generally say, you know, with carabiners, for example, if I would buy second-hand carabiners, I wouldn't worry too much because there's not too much that can go wrong with hardware. But if I'm buying a second-hand climbing rope, it's a very different story because a climbing rope, of course, can suffer a lot from use. Okay, so those are some tips to make sure that it's safe. And of course, perhaps, it is not on this slide, but still, being on an island like Curacao, you might also be tempted to, to go to building markets or marine shops to get ropes, etc., etc. I would, generally also advise you only to make sure that you use equipment which actually has been constructed for the use of climbing. So, you know that if you're going to use the rope that, for example, is used to anchor boats, yes, it's going to be very strong, but you have to consider it's not been made for climbing purposes. So that means that it might actually wear very quickly. And then you have to be also considerate of the fact that you might not actually be able to see this in the gear, while it still affects its strength. So generally also stick, of course, to gear which really has been made for climbing. Okay, then if we know that it's safe, the next question then is, how do I want to make sure that I buy the right gear? Because let's assume for a moment that you guys are also not millionaires like me. It means that you have to make choices about what you can buy. Climbing is a very gear intensive sport in a sense. There's a lot of gadgets and nice things that you can buy. And if you go into a climbing store, even if it's online, you'll find a lot of gear. But whenever you're considering to buy something, always ask yourself, what will you use it for? Any climber will use a harness. So there's not really a question whether you would buy a harness, yes or no. It's probably one of the first pieces of gear that you're going to buy. Although, to be honest, the first piece of gear that you always should buy are your climbing shoes because they are really personal. But for example, if you're seeing, a discount offer for a set of Black Diamond Camelots, and you don't really know anything about climbing routes without bolts, then it's not going to be the right decision to invest in that kind of gear, which is also, by the way, very expensive because you don't even have the skills yet to use it. Generally, I would say that if you consider to buy climbing gear, it's best to actually learn to use it first and then buy it. Because there are going to be factors that are going to affect your decision to choose for one brand or another based upon your experience with that gear. So what will you use it for? Also ask yourself the question, when will you use it? So if you're going to do a basic climbing course now and you're buying 10 quick draws, it's going to be in your cupboard for a while before it's going to be used for the first time because you first have to learn lead climbing. So if possible, postpone the purchase until the moment in time that you actually use the gear. Try it before you buy it. If you can, this can be really hard. But, ask around, and that's also why it's very important to have a good climbing network, because if you know a lot of people that climb, let's say that you want to buy a Grigri or you're considering to do it, it's of course very good to go to somebody who actually has that equipment, who has experience with it, so you can try it first. Because then you have your own experience and you know how it works and what you can do with it. Then some general guidelines. I would generally choose versatility over specialism. And what I mean by that is that if you want to be a conscious buyer, let's say, then what you want to do is you want to choose versatile gear that you can use for a number of different purposes. And then, because you have that gear, it means that you can do different things with it. There's also very nice specialized solutions for certain situations. But the question always is, if you buy a piece of gear for that, how many other situations can you actually use it for? And does that mean that actually for other situations you will again have to buy gear? Example that I'm showing you over there, you can see to the left in the picture there a sling which can be used for anchor construction, but also for a personal lifeline. And to the right there you see a sling which is really meant to be used as a personal lifeline, and that is very nice. And it's probably very ergonomical as well. but it's not going to be very much used when you're going to try to use that to construct an anchor, because that's not what it's meant to do. So in that case, I would opt for the sling, because the sling can be used for more than one thing. Another thing to consider is to choose simplicity of complexity, and this is especially true when you're starting out climbing. Two belay devices there, to the left an ATC XP, and to the right over there the Edelrid Gigajoule. The difference between these two devices, the one to the left is a very simple one. It's also quite cheap if you compare to the other one, which is a very extensive belay device, which is meant for multi-pitch situations. It's got an auto block, it's got a manual belay mode, it can be used with a guide mode, many things that you can do with it. It's also a little bit more expensive. Generally, I would say, especially if you start out your climbing journey, try to choose for simplicity over complexity, because it's easy to lose the way if you're adding a lot of complexity to it. And actually, you might actually have to study your gear very well before you know how to use it. So you want to consider that as well. And that is basically what I wanted to explain to you about climbing gear. Of course, if this would have been a webinar, then now would be a moment for questions. If you have any questions and you have my email address, or you're participating in one of my rock climbing courses, just send me an email and I'll be happy to look into it, of course. Thank you for your attention, and until we meet next time. Bye bye.